bit of a bugbear of mine, but having just been in Cannes for 5 days, I'm still appalled at the average pitch that creatives give me. I thought it's pretty obvious. I'm not really interested in having a 20-minute spiel about how wonderful their movie is. Yes, I don't mind them having 5 minutes, but given that average meeting is probably 30 minutes, it seems silly to spend the whole of it just pitching the film rather than the thing that I'm actually interested in, which is the collateral. So I do think producers should really, hone their pitch depending on who they're speaking to.
Welcome to Filmmaking Framed, your video podcast uncovering the realities of filmmaking. I'm your host, Danion Hughes.
And I'm your host, Tom Dexter. With us today is film financer Ian Hutchinson. Ian started off working for commercial banks in their film departments before becoming a partner at Silver Reel for 10 years and now works as a freelance film finance consultant for people like Piccadilly Pictures, Silver Reel, and on behalf of private investors. Ian has funded such films as Loving Vincent, The Wife, and Under the Skin. Welcome, Ian.
Thank you.
So, Ian, let's dive in. What is the role of a film financier?
I think it depends where you sit in the particular financial landscape. So if you're a classic film financier, that would mean you tend to work for a bank or a fund, and then your role is to usually speak to the producer, and the producer needs a certain level of financial acumen, doesn't need to understand everything, but you can't really have a meaningful discussion without some level of communality there. You will assess the project based on lots of criteria, depending on, again, what sort of risk position your investors are taking. But typically, you'd want to review the script, the track record of the producers, the directors, the cast. You would want to look at the collateral, which in terms of the tax credit would probably be where the jurisdiction of that tax credit is. And if it's pre-sales, the credit worthiness of those pre-sales. If you're an equity investor, you'd be much more interested in the creative side of things. If you're a bank, you're much more interested in the credit quality of the collateral.
And what are some examples of collateral that could be offered? So you mentioned the tax credit. Are there others?
Well, there's pre-sales, which are increasingly hard to get, but because of that, they're even more valuable. You can get sales advances from your sales agent against the gap or mezzanine position, and that's usually bankable. That's the three typical bits of collateral, but sometimes there's other bits as well. Some funding from soft funding can require cash flowing. Netflix sometimes funds, sometimes require funding, so it depends really. But there has to be a certain degree of certain amount of funding to make it attractive to banks. If you've just got a very small piece of say you've got just a tax credit on its own, or it's a fairly small production, you're going to struggle to find the commercial lender who will lend against that, for instance. And that's where the private individuals come in.
Makes sense. And before we really dive into film finance, how did you get into that world?
I had a midlife crisis. I'm an accountant by training, so I was at two banks. I was sort of head of finance at the second one. And I really had enough, and the general manager at the time started a media division. So I moved across, which was the worst decision I've ever made financially, but in all other regards, I've not regretted it, and I love my job, and I will do it for a long time.
Yeah, film very much seems to attract people who the love of the medium and the attraction draws people in who could, for example, with financing, I know from Tom, that people say, well, I could earn more in the financial sector, but I just love film so much.
That's right, yeah. I'm not a very creative person, but I love film, and that's the best I can do is film financing. Yeah.
I'm sure you're selling yourself short on that. And your colleagues, what kind of demographics do people tend to have? What backgrounds do people tend to have when they then end up working in film finance?
A mixture, really. If I think back to the times I worked for the two banks, some of the people who worked with me had no interest in film at all. They just viewed that as another
product.
Others were more passionate about films. At the funds I've worked at, there's a mixture of some entrepreneurs, people who had a distribution background. There's quite a few people who've tried to produce but have struggled and have sort of gone to the dark side. but people go the other way as well. There's plenty of financiers who think they know it all and end up producing. So it's a two-way street, that one. But, so a real mixture of people involved in film finance.
What does your day-to-day look now that you're working as a film financing consultant?
Well, luckily every day is different, which is part of the reason I enjoy the job. And you can have busy periods and non-busy, a bit like London buses. So suddenly, like post-Cannes, for instance, at the moment, there's a stack of projects, so I could look at them all day long. Other times it can be very quiet. So I'm constantly assessing projects. Unfortunately, sometimes saying no, but usually trying to find, because I work for different entities, I can usually find a home for most projects, but not all. So a typical day would be, I do read the scripts, not that I'm a real expert on reading the scripts, and we usually have external readers to do that, but I like to have a first read to see if I'm confused, then it's probably going to be confusing for everybody. I should be better than I am at reading scripts, but anyway. But more importantly, I look at finance plans, budget, sales estimates, track records. I do quite a lot of research into how similar films have performed. This is the sort of analysis that we do. And the modelling gets increasingly sophisticated, but I sometimes wonder if anyone knows anything in this business. Sometimes I think experience can be dangerous because you get stuck in a sort of or it used to be done like that, and things are changing rapidly. So, and the other thing is, of course, you're assessing a project today that's going to be released in cinemas hopefully in 2-3 years' time. So the world changes so rapidly now that it's quite difficult. But still, we still continue to model. We still continue to get it right some of the time, but not all the time.
Yeah, it's really interesting because film is, at the end of the day, it's an art. What you're making is an art, and what that end product's going to look like can also differ massively necessarily from what's on the script. But also like you say, what the zeitgeist is going to be in 3 years' time. We don't all have crystal balls, so it can be quite tough.
You say it's an art, and I think in Britain we view it as an art. I think if you go to America, they view it as a business more, and I think it's that happy marriage of art and business that usually gets films made, and usually successfully as well.
I was wondering, let's just knuckle down on the script thing. So what would a financer be looking for in a script when you're assessing it for finance?
Well, I think, again, it depends on the level of investment that's being made, but assuming you've got some risks in the execution of that product, you want to have a film that can be made for the budget. If you've got a film that's got huge special effects, but you've got a small budget, it's not going to work. So you're always looking to look at it in the context of the budget and the expertise of the producers. Is it a radical departure from the film that particular director has made before? They're the sort of red flags that they can be interesting, those movies, but they can also go horribly wrong. So it's trying to place that film in its appropriate context in terms of its finance and track record of the producers and director, etc.
Yeah, it's constantly, it's fundamentally it's risk assessment. So you're making creative assessments and then determining risk. Yeah. Because like I say, if there's a massive departure from a genre that a filmmaker's good at, you are essentially gambling more than if you'd seen that they'd done it before. But that's the tough art of balancing those two things. That's right.
Particularly when you work for a bank, they are literally risk assessing that. That's all they're interested in. The people who make the actual approval of the project, they don't care what the film's about, but they do care that the risk is manageable. And then if you work for an equity investor, much a different sort of evaluation needed there.
And how does it work with a finance plan that kind of depends on the cast that it attracts? Because you hear of stories like Robin Williams with Good Will Hunting, where you have these big stars that will do a project for virtually no money because they love the script. But presumably you, when you're presenting a finance, can't say, well, major cast are going to love this script because it's so good. So do they then tend to budget higher, assuming they'll have to pay the rates, or that they budget lower, assuming they won't be able to attract such a high-profile cast?
Well, we wouldn't finance anything unless the cast was confirmed. So that decision has already been made.
Makes sense. And how does attracting finance kind of differ when you're dealing with a private client versus when you're dealing with a film fund? In your role as a consultant, how does that kind of change?
Working for a film fund, it's all about return. Working for private individuals, it can be a mixture. There's always an element of red carpet behind these these private investors, they say they're return driven, but the amount of times they want to go on set and they want to, be associated with a movie suggests there's an element of attraction there. So it's a very, very different assessment.
So, because for often you assume for the private investors, they will have, even if they're quite prolific, they will have funded far less films than a film fund has. So the prestige attached with getting to go on set and see the cameras and see the stars, that's going to be a bigger draw than someone who's already funded, or an organisation that's already funded so many hundreds of projects.
Yeah, that's definitely true. Yeah.
So you mentioned that pre-sales is becoming rarer and rarer. What do you think it is that is kind of driving that drop?
Well, the obvious answer is the streamers. The introduction of Netflix and the rest of them has taken some money away from the business. I also think there have been quite a lot of high-level failures amongst recent films, which has made distributors wary of pre-buying a film, because if you pre-buy a film, you are taking a huge degree of execution risk. And to the extent you don't need to, you'd always rather wait and see the movie. And I think distributors can no longer afford to have too many sort of misfiring hits. So that's why the pre-sales tend to be in areas such as horror or genre movies, where it's less execution dependent, where you pretty much know what you're getting and you pretty much know what your audience is likely to be. Whereas I think dramas is where you've really seen the real fall off in pre-sales, because you just don't quite know. And rom-coms, is the chemistry there? It could be there on the page, but it may well not be on the screen. So I think these are the certain genres have definitely struggled to attract pre-sales.
I wonder if we could kind of go into some of the definitions of what pre-sales are and what different types of finance are, but maybe we could start briefly explaining to our audience the difference between a studio-funded model for film and an independent-funded model for film.
Right. I've only worked in the independent sector, so studio films are just funded by were funded by the studios, although increasingly they're finding other sources of finance now. But the independent market, again, there's degrees of independent movie. There's some pretty big independent films out there, 100 million plus. But the field where I've tended to operate is in the sort of 5 to 20 million range. And those sorts of films are typically funded by tax credits, pre-sales, gap or mezzanine finance, and so as much soft funding or grants as the producer is able to get, and some equity.
Yeah, I think that's the key thing, isn't it? That I think some people who don't necessarily work in the area or haven't made a film yet, they see the studio films that are just, say Disney comes in and goes, yeah, we're going to fund that, and they fund it. And they might understand that independent film is piecemeal. You put together lots of different pockets of cash in order to get to your final budget. And like you said, there's lots of different variations. So could you very briefly explain what the type of finance is, and then sort of define it quickly for people?
Sure. People typically define the finance in terms of senior, mezzanine, and equity. And senior typically includes discounting or cash flowing tax credits, pre-sales, both of which are payable really when the film's completed. So the producer needs the cash to make the movie. Mezzanine finance or gap finance, deficit finance is called. There's a lot of jargon in this business, and it's a bit confusing. It doesn't need to be. It's actually a lot simpler than it perhaps appears from the outside. And mezzanine finance depends on sales made by the sales agent at some stage once the film has started shooting, sometimes before it's finished, but can be later. And there's obviously much higher risk than if someone has already pre-bought the film, where you've simply got a credit risk on that distributor paying for the film. And then further down the waterfall, you've got the equity investor who recoups if all the pre-sales and tax credits come in as they should, if the gap sales are realised, and then the equity investor will guess what's left. And the equity investor is often hung out to dry. I think most equity investors realise there's a chance that's going to happen. I hope they do, because I think if you invest in enough movies, you can make money as an equity investor. But if you just do a single project, you're probably going to lose some or all of your money.
A lot of equity investors tend to be public bodies nowadays in the UK.
Yes. Yeah, there are. There's so-called soft equity, and there's hard commercial equity. There's passion project investors, which is the best you can have if someone really passionately believes in your project. But there are some people who genuinely think it's a commercially viable way of investing in movies, but they have to have deep pockets. They have to invest across a wide range of films to hit the jackpot. Because if a film really works, you can make a lot of money as an equity investor.
So would it be fair that equity investing is kind of similar to angel investing, where you put out on, say, 30 projects, and then you hope that one of those 30 will win so big to make up for the fact that you lose or make back very little money on the majority of the projects? So it's that you need to have deep enough pockets in order to take enough swings at bat in order to get a win.
That's right. I'm not sure it's 1 in 30. That sounds a bit extreme. But the studios used to say that 1 in 12 films really makes money. And none of that's true anymore. But the independent sector is probably even worse than that. So it might be 1 in 20 certainly before you hit the jackpot.
It's a negotiation, isn't it? When you're putting together these finance plans, so you mentioned the waterfall, which is where the flow of money comes in. So say someone puts in, you get £100,000, a certain amount goes to certain people first. So an equity funder would be someone who's either so convinced that this film's going to make money, or so comfortable with it not, that they all sit behind that senior debt and all these other funders, and before they get their money back.
Yeah.
So that's where it's more of a risk for them.
Yeah. There's always a discussion around deferrals, and you can often get actors to defer part of their fee in a risk position if they believe in the project, or if they need to in order to get the film made. And producers are always under pressure to defer fees. And I don't like investing in films where the producers have deferred most or all of their fee, because that doesn't feel like the right way that things should be done. But I know sometimes it is necessary.
Yeah, you're kind of exploiting the producer being so passionate about getting this off the ground that they then might not make anything for 5 years' work on that film.
That's right. 5-7 years' work for nothing. It's not for me. So I've never been tempted to go to the other side.
Yeah. And you mentioned that it's riskier when you try and get pre-sales while the project is still being made, because obviously the project might collapse. I'm assuming that means that the terms you secure when you pre-sell while the project's still being made tend to be worse, because the person you're securing it with is having to take the risk on that your project will fall apart.
Well, a producer will always tell you that if they pre-sell a movie, they're underselling their movie. And sometimes that's true, but sometimes it's not. In general, you'd have to say the value attached to a pre-sale is lower than the estimate of how that film will sell when it's finished. But in many cases,
it can be optimistic.
Bird in the bush.
But you sort of touched on something there, Daniel, which is the idea of a film finishing and being made. So once a film has been funded and all the parties have signed and it's been cash flowed, there's also an entity called a completion bond.
Yes.
I'm wondering if you could sort of explain what that is, Ian.
Yes, a completion bond exists in film, but less in television. Completion bond is a form of insurance, but in essence, it guarantees two things: that the film is completed to budget and to the script, and it also guarantees delivery to the pre-sale distributors, which is quite reassuring for the financier that the thing's not going to run massively over budget, or that there's going to be a problem in delivering the film. What you don't want as a producer, though, is for the completion bond to take over your movie, which they will do if they sense that it's running out of control financially, because then you just get the lowest common. The film will just be made to the minimum standards possible to get it out. So not everyone requires completion bonds on all movies, and smaller movies it really doesn't make a lot of sense. It's probably helpful for a producer to have a completion bond, but it does cost up to 2% of the budget, so it's not cheap. The thing to do is to try and make them work with you, not against you.
On some financiers will insist on a completion bond.
Yes, most will. Yes.
A lot will.
Yeah.
But also, like you say, if you can work these completion bonds, they have worked on lots of films and assessed a lot of budgets and production finance as it goes. And so if you are a first-time filmmaker, it can actually be quite good to have a completion bond, because the people who are working on the completion bond will be able to help point you in the right direction or steer you in the right direction. If you're a bit stuck, because they need the film to. Yeah. They don't want to pay out on finishing the film, so they want to help you as best they can.
Exactly right. They can look at the budget, look at the script, and see if the two sort of come close to matching, and that can be helpful. Yeah, I've been involved in nearly 200 movies. I've had a completion bond on most of them, but I've never actually had to call on it. So it's one of those elephants in the room that you want it there, but hopefully you never actually need it.
Kind of classic insurance that
Yeah.
when you're paying for it and not using it, you're going, that's a lot of money for, but you're paying for a peace of mind that you never want to be without.
Yep, that's right. If you were just financing a tax credit, the UK tax credit, you don't actually need a bond because you don't mind if the thing gets out of control and the spending increases, because that will increase your tax credit, and you don't really care if the film's delivered to the pre-sale counterparties. But other than that, it's probably wise to have one.
Can you sort of define very briefly what a tax credit is, how it kind of works? I know the rules have changed since the recent budget changes this year, but just a kind of general sense for how a tax credit is structured.
Well, there's different tax credits, as you know, all over the world. There's almost every country you could name, every region within the country. There's offers incentives to film there, so there's wide variety of tax credits. The UK tax credit is fairly simple, although the recent rules make it slightly more complex, but it's still, in essence, quite a simple thing. So if you make a movie that's up to 15 million under the latest rules, you can get the headline rate is 53%, but then you've got to take the tax off that, you get down to 39.75, and then it's only applies to 80% of your budget. So really you're looking at 31% of your budget can be covered by a tax credit that's payable when you've finished the movie, when you've closed the accounts, and you need to borrow some money against that, which you can usually do at about 10% plus, which is annoying for the producer, but so still, if you're getting 30 and paying 10, it's okay.
Yeah, so basically it's money that the government gives you back on your budget. So you spend a certain amount of money. There are things called qualifying and non-qualifying spend. You get a certain amount of qualifying spend back. You can then finance against, like you say, like it's collateral. Yeah. So then, say you have £1 million tax credit valuation, you might get 800,000 cash flowed to you, or 900. A certain amount that gets cash flowed, and then you can put that into your film and fund it. Yeah. So then you can actually get that film off the ground and make it.
That's right.
And we won't dig into detail of the tax credit, but if anyone's interested, it's in the UK, the British Film Institute operates and runs that, so they can sort of look in that direction, and we'll link some links there for how the tax credit.
The film has to qualify as British, but it's a fairly wide definition. It has to theoretically be intended for theatrical release, even though most films don't get theatrical release, but you can still say that you intended it, and you could, if you budget as if you're planning for a cinematic release, that can work as well. And if your tax credit's worth, say, £1 million, you'll generally be able to borrow about 900,000, about 90% is a typical discount rate that financiers apply to your credit, to give them a little buffer in case something was to go wrong.
And what is a kind of fag packet calculation of the number of feature films that are funded that then actually make it to theatrical release?
It's not a very high percentage. I was at a seminar last week from one of the leading accounting firms who deal with all these tax credits, and they reckoned only 3 out of 150 films that they saw had a theatrical release.
So if you're a newbie producer or filmmaker out there and your film does make it to theatrical release, even if it doesn't do very well, that's still... your wallet might not thank you, but you should still feel pretty proud.
You should. I'm not sure producers should get obsessed with having a theatrical release. It's often not the best route for that film. It's nice to have it, but by the time that distributor has paid the P&A to put it up, you're better off not doing the theatrical release.
What should you do instead?
Well, go to a streamer. I mean, nobody likes their movie to end up with a streamer, but often it's the best deal. It's where the ego comes in, of course. The stars don't want it, the director doesn't want it, the producer doesn't want it, but the investor will often want it.
Yeah.
And maybe that leads us into one of the questions we had, which is something which a lot of people who don't work in the industry might not understand. But in a nutshell, how do you make money in independent film?
Well, you make money by having sufficient sales of your film, and films are typically sold country by country. It's a very laborious, time-consuming process, but that's the way to maximize the value. There are sort of multi-territory deals you can do as well, but generally films are sold territory by territory. So you hope to sell your film all over the world. If you have a film that that works everywhere in the world. That's pretty hard to find, and you hope that eventually those sales are made for a minimum guarantee, which is the minimum they'll pay for the movie. But if the film performs well at the cinema or other medium, then eventually monies flow back into the waterfall, and it can take a long time. But a film that you've sold all over the world will eventually make money, and the producers will typically make their money from the net profits of a movie. The net profits is whatever profits are left after all the financiers have been paid off, and that's a negotiation, what percentage of those net profits the producers have, and the financiers always want a share of net profits as well. That's ultimately how you make the money.
And you mentioned that it can often make more financial sense to sell it to a streamer. Would it tend to be that you sell it and the streamer owns it forevermore, or you're licensing it for a period of time in a property? Because as we all know from YouTube ads telling us to get VPNs, Netflix has different, and all the streamers have different services in different countries.
Yeah, it used to be that Netflix bought it forever, but I think the recent trend has been for sort of discrete licensing period, so 3-5 years. But it's a price, very negotiation there. So
yeah, aspiring producers ultimately want to maintain control of the IP that they have. So which in this case is the film itself, because then that's how you monetize it. So it's like if you had any product, say you owned a car, you could lease that car to people. You can have that car for 2 years, you can borrow the car for 3 years, and you do the same with a film. So you can say like this particular distributor can distribute this film for 5, 10, 15, however many years it is that you negotiate, and then that control of that film comes back to you, and you can then resell it onto a catalog or a library, or a streaming service might. As there are lots of old films on streaming services, they've been sold to those streaming services for the right to stream them. So you can then keep monetizing in that way.
That's right. Yeah.
I'm curious what you think of how streaming has affected the financial model, because obviously the easy example is that Apple and Amazon kind of treat having a film and TV branch as like a nice afterthought. Like Amazon uses it as an incentive for Prime, and Apple uses it to sell iPhones, which is just a complete shake-up of the studio market, or even Netflix, which exists pretty much just for film and TV, though it's eventually into games. How has that changed things?
Well, it's changed things on the positive side because it's provided one more entity who might buy your movie. So as well as traditional distributors or broadcasters, you've now got the streaming giants. That's the positive. And the negative is that less films are theatrical now. The finance plans, they start off the same. In a funny way, the finance plan that I first saw 25 years ago is not a lot different from now. There's still tax credits or rebates of some sort. There were more pre-sales then, but there was still gap, and there was still equity. I think now you've got a chance that you fill your gap with streaming deals rather than classic distribution deals. But in many ways, it's not that different.
And the percentage that they were charged, does that tend to be pretty similar? So if the streamers provided gap financing or tax credit financing, because presumably even if a streamer, and this is an area I don't truly understand, even if a streamer decided to fund your movie, they would still look to get the tax credit back, I presume.
Not really, no. The streamer would just buy the movie for a certain price, and the distributor would buy the movie for a certain price. And the streamer price would generally be higher and will cover multi-territories to hedge their bet as well. But they wouldn't really be involved in the tax credit. On an independent film, that would be financed separately. You might have one financier who does the tax credit, the pre-sales, and the gap. But whether that gap is taken out by a streamer or a distributor really doesn't matter to the financier, as long as the quantum is sufficient to cover the gap.
Presumably, unless Netflix themselves are making that film, and that's when they'd be involved with a tax credit.
Yes, if they're involved from the start, that's right. That change, the whole equation's different. Then you can't get a UK tax credit, for instance, if Netflix are involved right from the start. Well, because it's impossible to demonstrate that you're going to release the film theatrically.
Interesting. So but studios can get a tax credit?
Studios, yeah, they very much can, and they're over here at the moment. They love the British tax credit.
I remember reading an article that the UK now has more studio space than Hollywood. So,
does, yeah.
yeah.
Having said that, I think there's been a slight there's been one or two high-profile studios have collapsed recently, and there was a funder who also collapsed as well. So I think maybe it's...
Yeah, it was a response to the boom, but obviously
Yeah.
studios take so long to build that by the time they've started to come online, the boom has expired.
That's right, yeah.
What's your view of the kind of longer-term outlook on... Because obviously the industry shrank about 38% from 22 to 23 in the UK. What's your view on it, kind of your prognosis going forward, if you could just grab your crystal ball?
Well, I'm an optimist. I do think there's... I think people are coming back to the cinema a little bit. The recent results suggest that's not true, but I think we've had some good movies out in the last 12, 18 months. And I think during COVID, obviously people got used to consuming content at home and never venturing out. But I think it's wearing off a little bit, and I think the future is okay. The film's always been in crisis ever since I've been involved in it. There always seems to be a reason not to make a film, not to finance a movie. But film, manages to somehow overcome these hurdles, and I think it will survive the COVID and this streaming boom.
I wonder if we could define gap funding a little bit more detail, just for people to understand. I mean, where does the word gap come from in the budget, and then what are they funding against, and what's the risk appetite of financiers on gap funding?
Well, I think the term gap came literally from the word gap. So people looked at a budget, they looked at what elements within that budget were financeable, which would be the tax credits and pre-sales, and maybe they had some equity and some grants, and the bit that's left was the gap. That hence the term gap finance. The current appetite for gap in the UK is fairly limited. The typical gap providers have recently sort of definitely pulled back in that area. They still get gap finance from the States, but across Europe it's quite tricky. Assessment of the gap is what I've spent a lot of my what I call career doing, and to do that you really have to you look at the sales agent, you look at the estimates that sales agent is attributed to each individual territory. You might extrapolate those estimates against territories that have already sold. So, for instance, if say France has pre-sold, that gives you some idea what say Belgium might go for, or it's only never know, but you can see if something's completely out of line. So the best finance plan is where the pre-sales are at a healthy level, because that gives confidence to the gap financier who's trying to assess how much those territories are going to sell at a minimum to cover that gap. And very few films work everywhere. I don't believe when people tell they've got a 4-quadrant movie, because independent films don't have the budget to make 4-quadrant movies.
What are 4-quadrant movies?
Movies that appeal to old and young, male and female. I think it's very tricky to, I think it's quite important to know what your audience is and to target that audience. Of course, you hope you get some crossover, but and equally when you're assessing the gap, you have to look at certain genres and which work in certain territories and less well in others, and estimates can be a little bit put together by sort of Excel somehow, and France must be 8%. That's lazy forecasting and estimating, I think. So it needs to be a bit more sophisticated than that. And again, the best estimates are ones that reflect the movie that they're doing, rather than just historically what that particular country has generated in terms of revenue share.
Yeah, you're right. Some genres sell better. So horror sells better generally, maybe for less, but will sell more widely. Yeah. And then comedy is something that's quite difficult to sell, because a sort of Western European comedy might not sell to Eastern European countries, because there might be a difference in humour.
That's right, yeah. I mean, I see a lot of British films that, quite honestly, may not travel. Some do, but they may not. So I think the perfect sort of script is one that is probably a local story, but with international resonance. That's the sweet spot that everyone's looking for. Even there, it's probably not going to work everywhere. It'll work in English-speaking territories and other countries. But there, Japan, for instance, take an example, has a distinctly different taste to to France or Latin America or Australia. So you can.
It's interesting as well because it can also be the politics of these countries. So there might be a certain subject matter that's in your script which might offend the royal family in Japan, and therefore the Japanese distributors wouldn't buy it. Or it might be that one country hates another country and you've said it in that country, and so they might be less interested. And there's so many elements that you'd have to think about that might affect the valuation of your film in various markets.
That's right. When China was booming about 3-4 years ago, it was really important that your film didn't have ghosts or whatever, because you could get a lot of business out of China. That's slightly fallen away now, but that's the sort of what you don't want to do though is try and do a sort of a film by numbers where you try and have a French actress for France. And I don't think they work very well. I think people see through those.
Yeah, it's also why you might have scripts where the terrorist or war country is just a made-up country, because by putting it in an actual country, you can offend the people you're selling to.
That's right, yeah.
And I imagine that's made harder with the kind of so-called decline of the movie star, that individual actors don't seem to be the same kind of box office draw nowadays than they were in past generations, and that it seems, at least from my perspective, that it was more the franchise of, for example, the Marvel Cinematic Universe. You went to go see a Marvel movie rather than, oh, I really want to see this particular actor in that movie.
Yeah, definitely, yeah. I think cast is a tricky area, because I know I'm part of the problem, because I prefer financing a movie with someone in it I've heard of. But I know deep down it probably doesn't make a lot of difference, and I think a lot of producers spend a lot of time chasing actors who the sales agent has told them mean something, or the financier says they want a certain level of cast, and that can actually be almost counterproductive. There are, as you say, very few actors who really move the needle now when it comes to sales, but we all want that sort of safety cushion, because you think it helps, but I'm not sure it really does deep down.
If you had like a Bruce Willis in your film, I know he's not really making films now, but let's say you had a Bruce Willis in your film, it might help with pre-sales, because certain markets might be like, I'll buy this because I can put it straight onto streaming, and I know that there will be people who sat at home half on their phone watching an action movie with Bruce Willis in. So you can kind of get a valuation, because some people they will just click and watch film because it's got a particular actor in. That's right, that's, I guess, kind of why you're trying to do it. But like you say, in terms of the how good the film is and how well the performance goes, might not.
Yeah, I think it depends on the genre. I mean, I think if you're making a horror movie, it really, really doesn't matter if you're making an average genre picture. If you're making a crocodile movie or something, they just need to be good-looking kids. If you've got a drama or a rom-com, it does matter. Which is why I think I see a lot of filmmakers in the UK, at least, moving away from drama now, because much as they might want to make dramas, and much as I like watching dramas, it's more tricky.
The business model's tough. Yeah. If you have like Olivia Colman in your drama, you've got a good shot with it. Yeah.
But I know 10 movies chasing her. There's always the same names that crop up, and they're not going to get them.
I think it's interesting. I feel like that's where you kind of undersell your role as a creative, is that you are making assessments on films and these creative valuations, and you're doing it in the guise of your experience over the last 20 plus years and how films have performed in different markets over that time. But you are, as a financier, making creative assessments on different genres, on actors, on
different markets,
that sort of thing.
Yeah,
that's true. What I probably meant was I'm not a financier who gives scripts notes or goes on set and has gives input into. I'll look at the finished film and I'll give my input as a consumer, but that's all it is. I don't think it should be more than that.
What's it like going on set knowing that almost certainly a memo has gone out letting people know you're coming and everyone should be on best behavior? Because I've been on that side, on the set side, where like the execs are coming on Tuesday and everyone's like, understood what that means.
Yeah, well, that's exactly why I don't really go, because I know I'm in the way. I know nobody really wants me there, and I know I'm actually going to sort of stop them doing their best day if I'm there. I actually ended up being in a film once, which really put me off, because an extra didn't show up. So
what was the film?
SAS Red Notice.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, we'll have to watch it and keep an eye out for you.
And a friend of mine actually saw me, to my horror. But no, I don't really go. No.
There's a sort of common saying or feeling amongst certain audiences about studio interference, right? So that they feel like certain directors have been, trodden on by the studios, and it's affected the quality of a film.
Yeah.
Obviously, the independent model is different, but what's your sort of sense of, or what's your involvement? Like, say you don't necessarily make the creative decisions, but are independent financiers, do they have heavy says on like what happens on a film or what's in the script? And is there a lot of interference by financiers?
I think it varies. I mean, many financiers ask for to be on a committee, the final cut committee. They're usually outnumbered by others, so they don't have ultimate final control, but they have some input there, and that's probably okay. I guess if you put enough money into a movie, you are sort of entitled to interfere. Whether that interference is in the best interest of that movie is a different question, but I guess it's always a negotiation. If someone funds, if someone wholly funds your movie, they're surely going to want some say in the movie.
And there's that balance between, for example, you get most famous ones would be someone like Snyder and director's cuts, where directors want to make movies that are so long that it will very likely impact the commercial viability of the project, both on the longer a movie is, the less times it can be shown in any given day in a cinema. So you're able to sell less tickets in terms of less times it can be screened. And then also you're more likely to run into people who, there's a kind of bizarre thing of, and I fall victim to it myself, where watching 4 episodes of television that are 1 hour long somehow feel like a less commitment than watching a 4-hour movie.
Yeah.
It's one of those questions I've never quite worked out why, but it does.
But another consideration is how long your film is its impact on it getting into festivals as well. If you've got incredibly long films, unless you're a really famous director or got a really famous cast, it might be harder to get into a festival because they've got program a certain number of films. And if you make it harder for yourself to get into one of these big festivals like Sundance, like Cannes, then again it might affect the value of your film at the end. So there's so many variations that the producers are trying to work out in terms of deriving value and making a film and getting the funding and putting together that business model for a film.
Yeah, I think I think most films are too long, and almost every film could benefit from 5-10 minutes of better editing. And Harvey Weinstein, for all his crimes, was very good at working out the right length for a movie. And I think and I think if you're an inexperienced filmmaker, I think if you can have an EP who's a bit more commercially grounded, perhaps it can be quite helpful to just fine tune that and just.
And it's so often there's a bizarre thing in the creative world where constraints enable creativity because they force you to be ruthless with what are the scenes, what am I trying to tell, how do I want the story to go. And so if you're being limited, it can provide focus, even if it doesn't necessarily feel the most fun to have those constraints. It definitely seems to help spark creativity, at least from my assessment.
I think it can do. I've worked with filmmakers who don't brook any interference at all. Jonathan Glazer will not allow you to do anything, and he makes brilliant movies. Woody Allen never even let us have the script.
But they have the power because of their track record.
Yeah.
That's
right, yeah.
Would it be fair to say that directors are in some ways bigger stars now than actors? So like a Tarantino film, for example, there's going to be an audience for that. Like very few people could have made Oppenheimer and it be commercially successful if it wasn't a Christopher Nolan biopic, like at least from...
I think it would depend, wouldn't it, on the film? Because I feel like we're film enthusiasts. We love film, and presumably a lot of people listening to this love film, and so we would be like, it's A24 the studio, or it's Jonathan Glazer, and we'll go see that because of that. Yeah. There will be a lot of people out there in the general public who'll just be like, oh, it's got Scarlett Johansson in, I'm gonna go see it.
Yeah.
And they don't know who the director is, or they just know it's got Scarlett Johansson in.
I think most people don't know who the director is of a movie, but I think you're right. I think there's a trend towards perhaps the director becoming more important. I think the poor old writer, no one ever knows who the writer is.
I wonder whether we can now kind of look at it for someone listening to this who wants to make a movie, but they don't really know how to make a movie. So let's say they're an aspiring producer. Let's say they've got a feature-length script, which is decent, but maybe they haven't made something before. What would you expect them to have in place? What would you advise them in order to start getting that film funded?
I think having made a short or two is always helpful for a producer. First-time producer is always going to struggle to attract finance. I think, you know, particularly if the director's inexperienced. I mean, but the chance of an experienced director taking on an inexperienced producer is fairly limited. So I think having a short is important. Given that, assume that's in place, then you need to have a realistic budget. I think the usual stepping stone idea that you make a million, then your next movie's 3 or 5 and 10. I think if you try and launch yourself too big, you just won't get it financed. So I think a degree of realism is needed, and you probably accept that you're not going to make much money from it, but it's an important sort of part of the whole process. You need to, if you can, to attract the best possible sales agent that you can. That's obviously tricky. But it's worth the effort if you can. Best cast you can. Again, not easy if you're inexperienced. You're always trapped in this vicious circle, of course, where the cast need the finance need the cast. You're not experienced. It's hard to nail anything down. You just have to hope that someone likes your idea. That's usually a key to some equity on a movie, which is usually needed to make a movie. It can be friends and family, hopefully not, but it can be. That's quite a common source for a first film.
But if you get like the BFI or BBC or Film 4 interested, and they come on, or help you both elevate that film, but also give you a kind of a stamp of, okay, there's something potentially good here.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. And look at where you can make your film. Is there some regional funding you can get? I mean, don't get completely wedded on your film can only be shot in X. When look beyond that. Probably look beyond the UK, perhaps even depending on what sort of movie you're making. Try and make it the best place for the movie, but also the best place for attracting some finance. It's a difficult marriage to negotiate, but I think that's probably what you need to do.
So kind of taking it each in turn, one of our first guests, or the first guest on the podcast, Toby McDonald, who's a 3-time BAFTA nominated director, has spoken about how now that shorts are easier to make because they're being shot digitally rather than on film, it has kind of devalued the value of making a short because it has made them both longer because you can just keep shooting on digital, whereas with film, once you've shot on that film, that's all the footage they'll be on that film. Is that something you've seen from your side as a financier, that trying to step up to your first feature financing, that there are now more shorts being shot, and so that he's correct that has devalued them?
I don't really see why that would devalue it. I mean, to me, it's good if it's easier to make them and you can make them a bit longer, so you can see a bit more of the filmmaker. No, my experience of inexperienced producers who've made a short is that it's actually been quite helpful.
What you're looking for in the short is someone, who can complete a project, so they show that they can put something together and make it and deliver it to a good quality. And then the real golden one is tell a good story. So if a producer's made a short film that looks good, and then the final one being that it's been shown at some big festivals. So if you have your short film get into Cannes or Sundance or BFI London Film Festival, then you go, okay, so this is a producer who can deliver a project, deliver a good story, and get it in and shown in front of audiences. So then you've got it. It's a good calling card. So if you shoot it digital and it's easier to do, but you've done those things, you're okay. It's when you shoot digital films and you just kind of rush into them and you don't do a lot of planning and then they don't end up being that good, or you spent $15,000 and the film's still because the script wasn't very good, and that's when I think maybe the short film isn't very helpful.
That's counterproductive. That's right. A bad short is worse than no short. That's for sure.
Yeah. So if you can get a good short before you start putting together your feature film and then attracting that financing, you almost want to master the craft of creating good short films, do that, and then start creating the good short films, and then put together your feature film and start approaching financiers and sales agents presumably first, and then all these equity funders.
I've known a couple of people who've managed to persuade a reasonably well-known actor or actress to just spend a day with them on the short, and that can be really helpful if you happen to be associated with. If you just know any sort of name, that's always helpful. That gives a bit of credibility to the short, and
that it's like that there's something to you that they were willing to spend the time when they could have either had holiday or done a project that they got paid for.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. But it could also be that you're not making short films, you've got a really good track record in music videos or commercials, but you've shown that you can create and deliver content. And then maybe you want a short just for the narrative side of it. But
how does financing differ between kind of film and television?
Whilst I've done nearly 200 films, I've only financed, I think, 3 television series. So I'm not an expert on TV finance at all. And one of them was Band of Brothers about 100 years ago. So the two
great show.
Yeah, I should stop there, really.
I did that one. It was fantastic.
Strangely, the two worlds are sort of, drawing closer, coalescing, because there never used to be deficits in television. Broadcasters used to pay a sufficient amount of money to enable the series to be made. But I think because TV's sort of moved to a whole different league now, so they're more expensive, got bigger stars, they cost a lot more. So these deficits have started to appear, and now, of course, you need somebody to fund that deficit. So the same people who do gap finance in film are doing deficit, as they call it, in television. So it's not that different. The credit risk is probably slightly better in television because your average broadcaster is a better credit risk than your average film distributor. The tax credits are generally more attractive in film than in television, though it does vary by country. But it's not as different as you might think it might be.
There's a similar principle in terms of, they don't necessarily call it pre-sales, but in terms of you make a TV show and then either you'll get a Netflix or Amazon to buy it, or even you sell it regionally by TV channels in each of those regions. Yeah. So in that sense, it's kind of, again, I've only worked in finance and I haven't funded much TV, but there are some tax credits, like animation tax credits in certain territories, which you can fund, which then if you make an animated TV series, that can work. Yeah. There's various things.
I suppose it's logical, as film and television become increasingly sort of indistinguishable, that so the financing is getting more similar as well.
But that's where it kind of comes down to the same principle of, as a financier, it's all about collateral and risk. Mm-hmm. So you can kind of move across into doing some TV if you can understand the collateral and risk on that funding.
That's right. I think it'd be fair to say television offers more, because there's always a chance of series 2, 3, 4, whereas you very rarely get independent films having sequels or prequels. So at least as an investor in television, you've got that chance. Once you get into a successful series, you can write it into your contract, so you can continue to go down that whole road. It can be quite lucrative.
Yeah, it can be negotiated in that you get a first refusal on funding the next one.
That's right. Yeah.
Which they do. What I've seen it they do in film as well. If you might put it in there, it might be a clause, which is almost certainly going to have no bearing, but it could be in there that if you do make a sequel, that we get the first right of refusal to.
Yeah, well, I've always had that. I've never ever exercised it because it's never happened. Yeah. No one's ever made a sequel of I don't think I have, at least. No.
Under the Skin 2 would be fantastic, though.
Never going to happen.
So let's say someone's come in, they've got some shorts under their belts. Maybe one of those films going to Sundance. They've got a feature film script and it's attached to a good UK sales agent. What are you then looking for as a financier when that person approaches you?
Well, it obviously depends on the film, but assuming it's a British producer making a film, you'd probably want a sort of home territory deal, whether that's television or distribution. I think that's the sort of your cornerstone financing, because trying to sell a film internationally without having your UK sort of sold is always going to be challenging. And in terms of attracting finance, it's going to raise a question mark. So I think if you can source as much of your budget from your home territory as possible, that's a good starting point. I'm assuming you're going to have some gap on your film. Then it becomes a question of pitching. I mean, It's a bit of a bugbear of mine, but having just been in Cannes for 5 days, I'm still appalled at the average pitch that creatives give me. I thought it's pretty obvious. I'm not really interested in having a 20-minute spiel about how wonderful their movie is. Yes, I don't mind them having 5 minutes, but given that average meeting is probably 30 minutes, it seems silly to spend the whole of it just pitching the film rather than the thing that I'm actually interested in, which is the collateral. So I do think producers should really, hone their pitch depending on who they're speaking to. You should have a different pitch for different sorts of financiers that are interested in different aspects of your filmmaking. So
that is such a brilliant tip, because I had completely forgotten, but when I watch a film finance, exactly that. Because sometimes you can be like, the script doesn't really matter. I need to know what the budget is, what the collateral is, what the valuation of it is. Have you got an accountant to tell me the value of your tax credit? Has that been done? Do you have a sales agent? So if someone comes in and spends 20 minutes explaining the different narrative beats of their film, it's irrelevant potentially to you, in certainly in senior debt. But then if they come in and say, so I'm making a horror film, it's got this person who's relatively known in it, it's about this, we've sold to the UK already, we have the tax credits roughly this value, that's funded, but we haven't yet funded the pre-sales or the gap, and we're looking for someone to fill that. This is the rough valuation of that. This is what we're going to look for. And then you can sort of say, well, this is our risk profile on gap. We wouldn't really do gap unless you have an equity funder attached. And then they go, well, okay, so we'll approach some equity funders. And there's a whole conversation there, but they've not wasted that time.
You're absolutely right, yeah. I mean, if a producer doesn't understand the fundamental financial terms, then you just lose faith in that. You don't think that producer's ever going to make that movie, let alone, no.
Yeah. But I've seen it also where when I've been at Cannes and filmmakers will come up to me and they'll say all the right words, but it's very clear they don't understand. So it's like when you're doing business plans and they're like, yes, dynamic, and then they're using all the buzzwords, but you're like, okay, you've spoken to me now for 30 minutes and you've not said anything to me, but you have said the word pre-sales gap and tax credit, but you've not told me anything, and I need to know the detail, the specifics.
That's right. What surprised me, I presume most of these producers have been to film school, and I assume at film school most people are taught how to pitch, but I'm constantly shocked. I think it makes sense to produce a film with somebody else, certainly when you set out, because you're unlikely to be creatively brilliant and financially literate. So at least go with someone who's got complementary skills, and then it's fine. Then you can sort of work out with each meeting who speaks and about what. But just to launch into a creative spiel for 25 minutes is not really the best.
And there are some producers out there, and sometimes they're hired specifically for this, but they're specialists in closing the finance of a film. Yeah. So for people listening, closing the finance is where you have to get all these different bodies. So say you've got for ease, say there's 5 different funders, and one of them funding the tax credit and the pre-sales, and maybe there's a senior debt lender and doing some gap as well. You've got the equity funder, and maybe some private investment, and you've got to get all those parties to agree. So you're negotiating contracts with them as an inter-party agreement that says, okay, I'm happy to sit under this funder in the waterfall of who's getting paid when, but I need a say on the committee for final cut. Yeah. So then you'd put that forward, and all of these different funders would have lawyers, and all the lawyers are talking, and they're all putting together. So there's a whole long closing process to actually get the funding greenlit and sent. And then there's something which we haven't actually touched on called bridge funding, which is where you need to shoot your film now because you've got locations in place and the cast is only available for a certain window, say. And so you need funding to actually start making the movie because you need the money, but you're still negotiating the closings. And then bridge funding. I mean, maybe you could define bridge funding for.
No, I think that's exactly what it is. It is ruinously expensive and should be avoided at all costs because, sure enough, your fees are going to pay those bridge fees, and you just need to avoid it.
What's the kind of typical fees or interest on a bridge loan?
Probably about 3-4% a month.
Yeah, I mean, it will depend on the financier because each fund it's because it's like say it's risk and collateral. So your risk is this film never closes its finance, and you will never get your bridge funding back. And so it's a huge risk compared to funding a tax credit. So you will charge crazy money and often per week, not per month.
Yeah.
if I'm
Yeah,
right.
often per week.
So
yeah,
you're
that's
charging per week. So if you go over, you can start shooting your film 2 weeks before you close the funding, and you get 2 weeks of bridge funding. That's still, it could be 3% a week.
what you ideally need is your equity investor to agree to sort of pre-fund, or somebody in your finance plan to pre-fund to avoid these very, very heavy charges.
Or you fund it out of your own pocket. So independent producer might not be able to do
Yeah.
that, but I've seen companies that have
Yeah.
maybe got 3 or 4 films already under their belt in a library that's generating revenue. They will put up front some of their own money. But then again, they're then putting up that risk that if the film doesn't close, which it might not, because it might be that a private investor pulls out or an equity investor pulls out, and then suddenly you're going to have to scramble together to get another funder to fill it in. And if you can't find that and you've already started shooting, that's a scary situation to be in.
Yeah.
So you generally speaking, you want to close the funding before you start shooting.
You really, really do.
Yeah. Because at least you can pull out then at that point if you don't close the funding.
But you're right. I think the actors, because particularly when you're at the start and you're not likely not to have a ton of money, there's a typical phrase in acting of one for them, one for you.
Yeah.
So they'll do a commercial project to earn money, and then they'll do one that they feel artistically inspired by. And they're more likely, you would assume, to try and fit the artistic projects in between commercial projects. So it might be, I love that project, but it has to be these 2 weeks because then I'm going on to the latest Universal, or and they're not going to go back to Universal and say, I'm so sorry, I really want to do this debut feature.
Yeah.
It's not even the actor, it's often the manager or the agent who just won't let them do it for purely financial reasons.
I want to ask you more specifically in your capacity, what are you looking for today, now in 2024, on when you're looking to fund a film that's perhaps different from any other point in your career?
I'm not sure I'm looking for anything different from when I started. It's at the end of the day, it's still my primary function is to get my investors money returned to them, hopefully with a premium or some interest or fees. Obviously, times are very different, but I don't think that fundamental principle has really changed.
What would you say, I guess, is the current appetite for risk on gap funding? Is that different from, say, 2-3 years ago?
Well, I think the appetite really is a function of has the risk changed, and gap has got a lot more risky in the last few years. So hence the gap financiers are pulling back.
I guess that's my question then, is compared to any other point in your career, what's the risk in the market now? What's it look like? What are you factoring in today that you might not have factored in 2-3 years ago?
I think what I've noticed is it used to be said that a film had some value everywhere. And now it's entirely possible that a film has no value in a certain territory, and that's a bit binary, and that's not really a very welcome situation for a financier, where literally their investment may not be worth very much money at all. So I guess that's the big difference. Obviously, when I started out, at the very start of my career, there wasn't really any gap finance. Most films were pre-sold enough to cover the budget, and then these gaps have gradually developed over time. But in the last 5-7 years, it's definitely got more tricky to close the gaps. There's still an enormous number of sales agents out there. There's still an increasing number of films made. So some of these are sort of counterintuitive, but it's definitely got more tricky, I would say. I can't think of any. There's always countries that are on the up and those that are on the down, but there seem to be more countries where there's a problem now than countries that are sort of pro-film. So just at the moment, the States now, of all the territories now, has now become a problem territory, the worst possible scenario. Because 3-4 years ago, there were loads of you could sell a pretty average movie for a few $100,000 at least. Now maybe there's no US deal. China came and went. Russia, it's getting tricky.
And you as a producer have to keep an eye on what's happening with all these markets as well as the financiers, because it affects the value of your film.
Yeah, definitely. I'm not sure as a producer you should actually go to to Cannes or Berlin, because I think they're in some ways the worst possible market to try and. Sales agent won't read your script anyway because they're so busy selling what they've currently got. You're not going to get any attention there, and I think you can just depress yourself. I think if you're not careful, you're better off sending these scripts sort of off market to people, to be honest, and concentrating on finding co-production partners at.
But it's also worth going to Cannes because you can go to some of the industry events and parties.
Yeah,
and
that's
meet these
worth it.
people,
Yeah,
and then say, let's have a follow-up meeting when we're both back in London.
Yeah,
or
I'll
come to Paris and we'll meet. Or
that makes more sense. But have a clear idea of what you're going to do rather than just go there and waving a script around, because it's a world of pain awaits you there.
I think it's really interesting what you say about how a lot of films would get fully funded just through pre-sales 20 years ago, and then those markets stopped pre-buying, so a gap formed. So financiers would fund that gap, saying that's fine, we'll fund it now, and then you can pay us back once it does sell. And now that those markets tend to not buy, that gap funding is becoming more risky. So it's like now you just, I guess, maybe shrink the size of your film budget if you have to.
Well, the problem is film budgets have been going up in recent years, so you've got a disconnect between sort of cost and value all the time, and that's the problem. And it's the problem that television's now facing as well. Not trying to sound too downbeat here, but something has to give here. But you have to find creative ways of making your film for less. Yeah. Maybe you have to, perhaps the scene that you really want, you just can't afford. You have to sort of cut your cloth to.
But you also have to, as a producer, work out if I cut that, because it'll bring my budget down, but it then reduces the value of the film.
That's right.
Because it's not as interesting.
Yeah.
It's a constant balance.
It is, sure. Yeah. Very tricky.
I mean, and there used to be a huge DVD market as well where films could make money
right.
through the peripheral stuff. You can't necessarily do. I did see some producers being like, "Oh, we'll keep our merch rights." And you go, "What? How are you merchandising this film?" I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Because people aren't going to buy a stuffed doll for this independent movie that no one's, not many people have seen.
No, indeed.
And I'm curious, from the kind of crew side, with the post-COVID lockdown boom, obviously rates exploded and the number of projects exploded, and team sizes also exploded because there was more of an emphasis on crew's mental health, and the scale grew, so the size of teams grew. So the effect was that a lot of people got stepped up very quickly. Like on my first role as a HOD, there were a number of people who were as a department for the first time, or in my own team, a number of people who was the first time they were at that grade was on that project. Did the same thing happen in the film finance world? Or were you more insulated in terms of the number of new entrants to film finance?
No, I think we were aware that there was a slight over promotion of crew going on for a certain period of time, but people learn fairly quickly. I mean, wherever you look around the world, anywhere that offers incentives, productions went there before the local crews were really, up to scratch. But in a fairly short period of time, I think you can get there. And whilst initially perhaps people brought their own local crew to Hungary or something, I think now the Hungarian, for instance, crews are excellent. And I think a similar thing happened here. There was a slight over promotion going on.
I imagine as a financier, you're probably quite used to seeing wide-eyed producers anyway. So you're used to people kind of maybe looking a little bit overwhelmed.
Yeah, but you're right. I mean, HODs is something we do look at. You want to have the production accountant's quite important to me. Not to the producer at all, but it's quite an important person. And I like to see experienced HODs. I don't mind first-time director movies at all, but I do like to have an experienced sort of production crew around him or her.
Could you explain very briefly why a production accountant is so important to you?
Well, at the basic level, that production accountant will provide me with cost reports so I can see how the film is progressing. I can see if it's on track in terms of the budget. I can also, via the completion bond, have the information, but it's very important. If there's a tax credit, the production accountant is crucial to me.
And how often would you want to have cost reports? Is that a weekly, a bi-weekly?
We ask for them weekly. don't read them all every week, but I tend to read them quite a lot. Just check them.
Well, the interesting one was that if you have multi-party finance, you've got other financiers on it as well.
Yeah.
A lot of these financiers know each other because they worked with each other on various films.
Yeah.
And so it might be that you aren't necessarily checking every single film's report every single week, but you're in conversation constantly with the other parties. And the other parties might say, oh, we think there's a problem occurring here. Then you read the reports and check them. And there's a whole ecosystem. And and especially in the UK, it's a very small ecosystem.
Yeah.
So people do know each other. And
we do. It's a fairly small world, and we do all sort of work together really rather than against each other. That's right.
And on the cost reports, some advice that I got from mentors when I was stepping up to HOD was that you are better off over budgeting and then being able, as you go through the project, being able to constantly come down, versus if you try and calculate, here are all the locations we've got, here's how much kit I've got, and trying to be really calculated and then incrementally going up as new things change and scenes get added, or that makes you look worse than if you had asked for more money and then you get to be the hero each week bringing it down. What's your perspective as a kind of financier on that? Would you rather that your initial cost reports look more scary, but that they look more scary because you've got heads of departments building in a considerable contingency, or would you rather that they are more accurate but then you're seeing the line potentially trend upwards?
Well, as a financier, I love to see a big contingency, and I like to see buffers everywhere. But the reality is that all budgets, nearly all budgets, are absolute minimum that can be made for. And also, to be honest, the first few weeks of every film, everything's on budget, because whatever's been spent, and then there's another column that says cost to complete, and it all comes to it's only probably towards the end of shooting where you really begin to see what's happened. By then, it's arguably too late anyway.
A lot of these budgets will be kind of built and in place before the film closes, so they're unlikely to suddenly inflate up after the fact. But another thing I just thought of, which is you also want the film to be roughly you don't want it overspending, but you also don't want it underspending, because the value of the tax credit will reduce. Which is why obviously financiers will put a buffer in case the value of the tax credit goes down. But if you see a film coming wildly under, you'll go, why aren't you spending the money? Because you need that money spent.
Well, not necessarily. If you've managed to negotiate that any underspend goes to you,
it kind of pays you back.
You're actually quite happy.
That's true.
And what is the best piece of advice you've ever gotten? Doesn't even need to be related to the industry.
It's not the best advice, but the advice that stuck with me was in my first week doing film finance, an experienced producer came up to me and said, whatever you do, don't go for a credit, because the film's probably going to be shit. I've never forgotten that. It seemed a deeply cynical thing to say, but I sometimes think about it when I ask for a credit.
But do you often get credit anyway on films as financiers? There's a whole negotiation about how many producers are listed, and
it's got a bit silly, hasn't it? Really, I think. Where I was on a film recently where there's 36 executive producers. And I always vote for those at the end of the movie when everyone's hopefully left the cinema. But it's unfortunately, it's just the fact. It's very frustrating for the real producers to have so many, associate or executive producers, and particularly with films that had a few false starts, as people who've got sort of historic ties to the movie, and it must be quite irritating. But investors like credits. I guess I'm quite glad I got one or two, but I'm really not fussed anymore now. I've got enough that doesn't really make any difference to me now. So, but once one set of financiers asks for credit, then everybody does. It's if we all perhaps would hold back, it might be a bit beneficial for the movie.
Because it becomes one, if you then don't ask, then it makes it look like it was financed by them and your company wasn't involved.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, but it's a bit of a shame.
We're going to have to draw us to a close, sadly. We could have gone to a lot of these topics a lot more, but any sort of last minute bits of wisdom you'd give to sort of first time producers, directors on their films in terms of financing?
The last tip I would give is to nurture your financiers, because classically, once you've got your money, people move on. And I've seen it again and again where investors are burnt off, and it's much harder to get a new investor than keep a happy investor. And I've never really understood why producers so often burn off investors. Your film may not work, but at least communicate and do your best to navigate their way out of their financial hole. Just to abandon them seems to be crazy, because they certainly will never come back then.
Particularly because this is a very incestuous industry where it's everyone kind of knows everyone, and you'll ask and go, "Oh, how was so and so?" And actions have ripples beyond what you can calculate at the time you make them.
Yeah, and you never know, where your career is going to be in X years' time. So, I mean, don't make enemies when you don't need to. It's tricky enough as it is. So, be nice to everybody on the way up. Yes.
Be nice to everyone on the way down.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you have to turn up to Cannes with a fake moustache. Hey, looking for fun by film. Amazing. Thank you so much, Ian. It's been a real pleasure.
Yeah,
Pleasure.
it's been an honor talking to you.
Thank you.